This is Resident Evil 4. It is one of the best known video games in history, with probably more ports than any other game besides Doom. Although this is a very well known game, this version in particular is very rare. This is the Zeebo version of the game. Zeebo is a console based on the Brew application platform, a platform that was specifically designed for distributing applications over 3G, which even in its heyday was painstakingly slow. The first version of RE4 came on 2 GameCube discs. It was one of 20-some games on the entire platform that were big enough to require multiple discs. On the flip side, the Zeebo version of this game was small enough to be distributed through a max speed of 2 megabits per second. The whole game was packed down to 7 megabytes, that is almost small enough to fit onto a Super Nintendo cartridge. This is not a good game, but it is a marvel of engineering. Not just the title itself, but the entire platform. It was something built to fill a very specific need at a very specific time. In the years since, the market it served has been filled by more advanced versions of the very same mobile technology which made the platform possible to begin with. The servers for Zeebo have long since been shut down. The consoles themselves have become a niche collector's item, with a used console running you somewhere around the same price as a brand new PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X. Yet we will soon be able to experience the games released on this platform again, and that is entirely due to the painstaking effort taken by emulation developers. Without these efforts, thousands of titles would have already been lost to time. Publishers, for the most part, have left it up to the community to preserve their own history. The early content of all other existing mediums are almost entirely gone. The first series of Doctor Who simply does not exist, besides a handful of episodes that have been pieced together. We have a unique opportunity, given the digital nature of our world, to make sure that the first days of video game development are preserved for all future generations. There is absolutely no logistical reason for us to not be able to do that, and supporting emulation development is the easiest way any of us can support this effort. Emulation has been a key part of not just video game preservation, but the whole of software preservation since the 1960s. It began in a very utilitarian way, with IBM coining the term emulator to describe how they managed to get their brand new System 360 mainframes able to run software developed for previous generations. This practical use by large companies has basically remained unchanged, with Apple first using it heavily to support the transition from Mac OS to Mac OS X. Microsoft has utilized the tech since the first days of the 360 to get Xbox games running. Nintendo since the launch of the Wii to get a whole range of their historic games up and running on new hardware. Sony has used it since the introduction of the PlayStation Classics line on PSP in late 2006. And the granddaddy of them all, IBM, utilizing it to this day to get software from System 360 running on the mainframes they continue to manufacture today. From a commercial standpoint, the debate over whether or not emulation is a good thing does not exist. The conversation only begins to heat up when we enter the realm of anything that could possibly be associated with piracy. Emulation is perfectly legal. The development of emulators is also perfectly legal. Creating an image of a disc or cartridge you own and playing it in an emulator is once again perfectly legal. However, we cannot get beyond the fact that the vast majority of emulation is done by illegally downloading old images and then playing them in emulators. This piracy has caused all sorts of issues, including, and not limited to, the original platform creators such as Sony and Nintendo suing emulator developers in an attempt to stop the development. They take these drastic actions even though both companies have been caught shipping commercial products that use the same emulation technology that they have been trying to shut down for years. If these companies had succeeded in stopping emulation, then they themselves would have missed out on revenue and support for their legacy platforms on modern consoles would at the very least be far behind where it is today. Sony is seemingly incapable of finding any way to support PS3 releases in a modern commercial manner. Meanwhile, the open source community has already solved this problem. At the time of writing this, over 2/3 of PS3 titles are playable, in RPCS3. 97% of titles are already bootable, and this has all been done while Sony insists publicly that PS3 is just too complicated to be supported. PS4 emulation is already well on its way. 360 and Vita are a bit behind PS3, but they are coming along nicely. The original Xbox has finally, just in the last year, gotten a decent emulator, which has done more to preserve the console than Microsoft has been able to do with years of development and millions of dollars. Just about every other platform relevant to gaming history has been nearly perfectly emulated, with things as obscure as Zeebo being emulated. Currently, the only platforms the hobbyist community is not actively tackling are PS5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X. The reality is that without hobbyist emulation, a huge part of video game history will be lost to time, especially now that more and more distribution moves into online storefronts. In 2010, a game called Shank came out on Xbox 360 and PS3. Today this seems like a footnote in video game history, but at the time, it was one of the first original major releases in the side-scrolling beat-em-up genre in years. It was also part of a wave of retro revivals first started a few years earlier with games like Geometry Wars and Super Stardust HD. This continued through the decade with more games like Braid and Shadow Complex. Digital distribution made these old styles feasible again from a commercial standpoint. That has only exploded in the past decade, but the very nature of the way they are sold now threatens to turn these games into vaporware. It's been impossible to legitimately purchase Shank on its original platform for over 5 years, but right now you can go and play the original release on your PC via emulation. You're going to need a relatively powerful PC, but that barrier of entry will only go down as the years pass. With the PS3 store already at one point threatened to be shut down, and with the 360 store shut down, the danger of original titles being lost to time is only growing. For Microsoft's credit, they have done a lot to bring backwards compatibility to their modern Xbox platforms, but a large majority of 360 titles are still not available. On Sony's side, the best they have been able to do is release collections and remasters of PS3 games over the last 10 years. While this is something, an incredibly small fraction of the PlayStation 3's library has been preserved this way, and it still does not preserve the original status of the games. As time goes on, textures are re-exported here, lighting systems are improved there, and AI routines are upgraded to make use of more powerful specs. After a while, it's barely the same game. On top of that, we have publishers themselves going out of their way to make original versions unavailable. There is the infamous removal of the original GTA 3 trilogy to only be replaced by, at best, substandard, and at worst, absolutely unplayable versions of 3 of the most important games ever released. Even some of the less malicious examples of this, like Square Enix, constantly re-releasing old Final Fantasy games with slight changes every single time, is problematic. In movies, it's weird that we basically have no way of watching the original release of Star Wars. But that sort of special editionization of media is quickly becoming the norm in video games. The Last of Us, another one of the most important games ever released, has over the course of 10 years seen 3 major revisions. The original was already threatened to be delisted and is probably unlikely to last much longer. The second release will probably follow once PS4 revenue shrinks to be a small fraction of Sony's profits. In all likelihood, we are going to get to a point where the earliest version of The Last of Us available for purchase will be the 2022 remake, which is so different from the original that it might as well be a different game. All of this leads to the gradual loss of available ways to play old releases. Just like a boulder rolling down a hill, if left to the publishers, this loss will only grow as time goes on and eras of gaming pass. With all of the effort Sony has done to bring games forward in remasters and collections, they still have massive titles like the first and second Infamous and the last Twisted Metal still stuck on PS3. We still have yet to receive a modern way to play Metal Gear Solid 4, arguably the most divisive game in one of the most important series of all time. That's not even to mention some of Konami's other contributions to the slow loss of gaming history. Even if you played PT and had it installed on your PS4 at the time, since Konami severed ties with Hideo Kojima, you cannot even install it from your list of Doom titles. All of these problems with game preservation mentioned so far are more relevant in the age of digital distribution. But once we go back further in history, things get even worse. Digital storefronts for consoles back to the mid-2000s still exist, allowing people to purchase titles that have yet to be played. Before then, we rely on the retro game market to preserve gaming through the persistence of rotting discs and aging hardware. The idea that we are going to simply hold on to discs printed in the 90s to preserve video game history is ridiculous. Panzer Dragoon Saga is another landmark release that can easily hover around $1,000 in secondhand markets for a decent copy. Having these things sitting in private collections is one thing, but relying on those collections as the means to preserve media is simply ridiculous. When you look at any other media as an example of how these things should be handled, that becomes obvious. It's not like people are pulling out their personal 35mm print of Nosferatu from 2020 to be able to experience a movie that should be available to everyone. The reality is that the only way we are going to be able to preserve these games for the future is by persisting them through the emulation and hacking community. We absolutely cannot rely on publishers to do it. Imagine how much more interesting the world would be if someone had the foresight and ability to preserve books from 600 years ago when the printing press was invented. We have a unique ability to preserve every single item in a new medium for the first time in history, and there is no reason for us not to do it. On the rare occasion that a publisher has made their games available, then it is incredibly important to support that effort. The goal is that these publishers make as many games as possible available for people to experience in a modern way. Xbox has done a great job with trying to get as many games as they can supported on modern Xbox consoles. With the recent acquisition of Activision, there is a potential that even more games can be supported like this. Steam and GOG have made it almost too easy for publishers to keep legacy games available. Although sometimes the games they are distributing are heavily modified from the originals to the point where they may even introduce new bugs the original release didn't have. In those cases, financially supporting the preservation of those games is still essential, but I don't think there is any issue with double dipping and finding a better version of the game. Ideally, publishers would make both the original versions of games available, as well as any new versions they want to produce. There are plenty of people that simply pirate games because they can. But there is a huge group of people who don't have a way to legitimately find the games they want to play. Publishers and platform holders have no reason to not take advantage of this situation and remove that illegal barrier. Someone owns the IP rights to the Odyssey 2 library. Maybe even a few people. The owners of those games could be selling them for a few dollars a piece to the 10 people a year who go looking for them. They could even include an emulator in the download and make the game a simple executable that anyone can use. A distribution platform like this could be expanded to all platforms to give people a legitimate way to buy the rights to an old executable. This gets people off harmful websites, establishes a way to preserve these games, and makes it easier for people to access them. This also gives the owners of these games, who have been unable to make money on them since the death of the original platforms, a way to once again make a bit of money. Without a commercial solution that makes it easier for people to access these old titles, this is always going to be a problem. It seems like such a simple thing for publishers to do. Fighting with the fans of their games accomplishes nothing, and so much could be done to preserve and enhance these games. Until that happens, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't continue to download them. At the moment, it's the only way they are truly going to be